I got all my best political ideas from my father, God bless him, who went back just 50 years ago. He was a revolutionary socialist in his outlook, but always voted Conservative because he got respect for others who weren't. He said that whenever you're shown around a house by a prospective vendor, the first thing they talk about is the view. They didn't put the view there, so why should you have to pay them for it? He said, what do people mean they own the land? People died fighting for the land. An Englishman's home is his castle, but when people say they own land, they're committing treason. If you're lucky enough to have the Queen visiting you, you always knock before you enter the room she's in. That's because she's the head landlord, and it's her property you're wanting to enter. Land is called real property because it's royal or regal, like the football team Real Madrid and Montreal in Canada. All land in the UK and presumably other common law countries such as the USA, Australia, Canada, Jamaica and so on is owned by the state, and all anybody else can own in it is an estate or interest. William the Conqueror claimed he owned the land by right of conquest. Leaving aside the fact that he was an invader, and thus like the Vikings and Kaiser Wilhelm, not entitled to participate in the democratic process, democracy has no argument with that so long as he accepts that he owns it not on his own behalf but on behalf of the inhabitants as parens patriae, the father of the nation. The trouble was that under the feudal system he divided up most of the land and gave it to his barons in return for services of supposedly equal value. This arrangement would today be called tied accommodation, just like farm workers might get. This did not satisfy the barons, who wanted to be able to pass the land on to their descendants and otherwise dispose of it just as if they were kings themselves. This culminated a century and a half later in Magna Carta, which ossified landlord and is the epitome of capitalism and ancestor worship that it is today. So often put forward, especially by Americans, as the beginning of democracy, Magna Carta was exactly the opposite. It was not the start of it bringing democracy to the people. It was expanding the number and power of their oppressors. The barons divided up the land among themselves, and like the Roman senators, what did they need a king for? People change. When I was at school, the subject I hated was history. Now it's my favourite subject. It was George Santayana who said words to the effect that those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. This is exactly the same situation as the Roman Empire in pre-imperial days, when the senators owned great estates. It wasn't the people of Rome who got rid of the kings, it was them. Under the feudal system, the king gave the right to hold land in return for services of equal value to him, called service and suit. The land therefore had no monetary value. Democracy likewise requires a tax on the holding of land, such that the market value reduces to zero. Such people would certainly be entitled to call themselves landholders. It was argued by that salacious journal, the Daily Telegraph, no lover of democracy, that in the case of compulsory purchase of land for such as motorways, the compensation paid should be 10% more than the market value. This land tax should reduce the market value to minus 10% to countervail the propensity of wealthy people to own land purely for the vainglory of strutting about on it, riding on it, hunting on it, while poachers and mass trespassers of the 1930s go to jail. The land tax is in the form of a ground rent or feud duty. The argument will be raised that for those who claim to be landowners already, that to have to pay rent for what they already own is depriving them of their property, contrary to the European Convention of Human Rights and similar. Such treaties need to be denounced pro tanto and pro tem. There is nothing inherently wrong in land being held by foreigners, however this term is defined. Sanctions were imposed by the USA on Cuba after the revolution because the latter confiscated the land owned by the Del Monte Corporation for growing pineapples and distributed it to the population as subsistence farmers. Through doctrinaire socialism, this missed a wonderful opportunity. If instead of confiscating it, Cuba had simply imposed the land tax, what possible objection could there be? If the Del Monte Corporation found it was uneconomic to farm the land, they would simply abandon it. The opposite approach was used in the Soviet Revolution, the immediate consequence of which was the forced collectivization of farms. So far from working together for love of their fellow man, this meant that nothing was ever done because there was always somebody else to do it. Beyond producing enough for their own immediate needs, no food was produced and mass starvation resulted. By complete coincidence and exactly at the same time and for the totally opposite reason, exactly the same happened in the Great Depression in the USA. While people could not afford the price of milk, landowners poured vast amounts of milk down the drain simply to maintain the price of milk. As depicted in the film Ship of Fools, landowners in pre-revolutionary Cuba burned vast acreages of sugarcane simply to maintain the price of sugar. This is exactly the same as the set-aside policy of the European Union, where farmers, landowners, are paid money not to produce crops. Nowadays, supermarkets throw away vast amounts of produce that isn't the perfect shape and blemish-free simply because by selling it to market traders, the supermarkets would be undercutting the price they could charge for their produce. Quite rightly, this has just been made illegal in France. Instead of tackling the system of land ownership that permitted this, Roosevelt's New Deal imposed a system of forced labour based on Keynesian economics, not wholly unlike Stalin's gulags. It is important for what follows to see that capitalism and socialism coming to exactly the same conclusion. Both rely on an altruistic human nature, and human nature isn't altruistic. Brother, comrade, can you spare a dime kopeck? Cuba has recently started leasing land instead of giving it as subsistence farms. If rent is equated to land tax and is used for the benefit of the public, this is perfectly democratic. China has bought vast tracts of Africa and elsewhere to produce food not for sale to local inhabitants or the free market, but expressly to feed its own population. This is undemocratic. The so-called fair trade movement seeks to keep subsistence farmers in occupation of land around the world by artificially enhanced payments for their produce, by playing on the public's longing for the rural idyll, when the crops could be grown much more economically on proper farms. This is equivalent to paying people to have babies, just like the Save the Children Fund and UNICEF, and is the worst possible solution. The main aim of the Common Agricultural Policy of what became the European Union was to subsidise peasant farmers in what were part-time jobs paid for by the labour of those in factories and offices. For demographic reasons, countries such as Germany wanted to keep a large part of their populations on the land. One example was that of a university professor who kept one of these small holdings purely for the benefit of the cheap income it provided him. The land tax should be increased to make it uneconomic for it to be farmed as a small holding. The land tax is not likely to result in vast amounts of land simply being abandoned, since just like the Plains Indians and those subject to Tudor enclosures, people have still got to eat. As that well-known capitalist John Wayne said, "I love America so much I bought a piece of it." Whatever he paid for it, whomever he paid for it, it certainly wasn't the Native Americans. Many people have given their lives for it. They are the ones who love America. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. In the Second World War, local committees had to be set up to determine whether individual farmers were producing food efficiently. Those who were not doing so were forced to sell the land. The theory of the free market is that the market price of agricultural land will be the revenue, not capital and value, that someone using the most efficient forms of agriculture of the time is willing to put on it. What price would the Plains Indians put on the land they used as nomadic hunters? What price would the medieval serfs put on their strip agriculture? Owning land is exactly the same as owning slaves. People have to have land in order to produce crops to live on. So where's the difference? In the far more democratic Anglo-Saxon times, kings were elected. William the Conqueror was the last elected king. Nowadays, kings are produced genetically. The theory is that the ablest people will be the wealthiest and thus able to attract the best mates and thus produce the best offspring. That is the meaning of the word aristocracy, the rule of the best. Eugenics is rightly denigrated in modern times. The first act of the Queen's then new son-in-law, Lord Snowdon, was to rush off to an agricultural college to find out how to maintain his new wife in the style to which she was accustomed. What about those in the agricultural college who got better marks in the exams? Don't they deserve priority? Many farmers are produced in the same way. Many times you hear of elderly farmers on farms that have been in the same family for generations, staying on in their farms long beyond the time when they should have retired to a tower block in Bermondsey, where they can have better access to the services they need in terms of health and welfare. What can they possibly want to retire for? They've got a nice little part-time job. Why should they even want to pass it on to the next generation or two, theirs or anybody else's? Nor does the answer lie in socialism. The There was an interview with Dennis Healey, him of the eyebrows, the former Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, who caused such damage to this country with his Keynesian economics in the 1970s, who became the owner of just such an estate. His defenders say that the Chancellor of the Exchequer wouldn't be much good if he didn't know how to feather his own nest, which begs the question, what good? The same applies to the professions. Universities are for training the sons and nowadays the daughters of doctors to be doctors and lawyers to be lawyers. As rightly expressed in the USA, if you're so clever, why ain't you rich? Wealth and ability are generally mutually exclusive, to which I can testify personally. What we have now is a system of land holding that is identical to the system of purchasing commissions in the army. This was found to be wholly ineffective in producing an efficient army. It may be noted that the system in the Soviet Union of soldiers electing their own officers was rapidly abandoned. A similar system also applies to taxi drivers, where the number of taxi licenses is limited by the local authority. The taxi drivers are allowed to buy and sell their license just like fishermen are allowed to buy and sell their quotas. Farmers have respect for government agricultural advisors, often far better qualified than themselves, as that they can't afford to farm, i.e., in other words, they can't afford the capital investment. Many names at Lloyd's are based purely on land ownership, when the benefit should go to the public as a whole. Increasingly, financial institutions like private pension funds are buying up land and employing farmers to farm it for them. In democracy, farmers will be able to farm in their own right, not as mere employees. The effect of the land tax is that in democracy land is not owned by private pension funds but by the public pension fund. This tax can be commuted to a franchise fee for 7, 10 or 20 years, just as is used on the railways now. When franchises change hands in the same the same trains run on the same lines. All that changes is the colour of the paint. The effect of the nationalisation of, say, the coal industry is that by collective wage bargaining and the threat of strikes, the workers in that industry are able to act as owners, regardless of the fact that in a democracy coal is a natural resource like land belonging to all. They were also depriving future generations of it, which I deal with below. Football is a territorial game, and the territory displayed on is that of the public. Football clubs are entitled to the full free market income, and footballers and their managers, etc., are entitled to the full free market value of their wages. But we do not have a free market, but one grossly distorted by the absence of a land tax. Leaving the side of cost of buildings on the land, what weekly amount would just persuade the owners to remain in possession? When asked what he thought about the fact that the huge prices charged for watching football matches were preventing the original supporters from watching the matches, the former Arsenal manager Arsene Wenger said, "Each person must decide for himself how he values it." In other words, the free market rules. Just like the national lottery, spectators will be far happier paying the entrance fee if they know a substantial portion of it is going to themselves as a whole. In a democracy, it is the public that are entitled to maximise its profits. The proceeds of land tax belong not to the government but to the public. Though the term has been used before, The aggregated sums go to form a national dividend, which is what each individual person has to live on. It takes the place firstly of child benefit, unemployment benefit and state pensions. Unlike both capitalism and socialism, in a democracy everybody's life is worth exactly the same as everybody else's, so this will be the same for everybody. The absolute value of this dividend will obviously depend on the number of people in the population. However, this term is defined, which I'll deal with below. A land tax has been tried before in colonial Africa in the 19th century. The landlords simply increased the rents and the tenants were forced out, resulting in mass starvation. This was because the land tax wasn't high enough to bring the value down to zero, so that the landlords simply abandoned it. And there was no national dividend for the erstwhile tenants to live on. The situation is exactly the same as Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. Income corporation tax are wholly ineffective substitute for land tax. In that wonderful Oscar Wilde comedy, The Importance of Being Earnest, the prospective mother-in-law's only concern is not with her prospective son-in-law's achievements and prospects, but whether he has any assets, and whether they were in land, in other words old money, or in the funds, in other words new money. Land is an asset belonging to all. The people on it are assets to themselves and each other, not belonging to the land like slaves on a plantation. That is not what Grey Owl meant by man belongs to the land. They increase in value by teaching, and learning. And it's the teachers who are making the investment, not the landowners or the state.